Hello and welcome back to this rather slow and meticulous reading of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. We've done 2 sessions on book 1 and now we go on to book 2, which is one probably of the most dense books or chapters in the whole book. And it's going to need quite a bit of attention to get through, so we'll probably need 2 sessions just on book 2. Okay, what has happened so far? Needless to say, if you haven't watched the other videos, this one's not going to make much sense. But we're looking for the supreme good, the Tom Ellis of all our activities. All our activities aim at something. What is the final end of everything? Eudaimonia, a technical term which is difficult to translate into English. Sometimes it's translated as happiness, but this is a little bit lacking because it makes you feel of superficial, fleeting feelings. Whereas eudaimonia is a more deeper concept, is a feeling of flourishing and of a life that's lived well. What is eudaimonia? Well, he presents the function argument. To find out what the good life for a man is, we must find out what is the good for man. So what is the function of man? The one unique thing that human beings have, that animals don't have, the ability to reason. And he brings all this together and he says, eudaimonia then, the flourishing life, is the life in accordance with reason, in accordance with the function, the unique function of man. That is the life of virtue. So, what is virtue? This is where book 1 stopped. And the rest of the book is going to be an account of what is virtue. So he starts off by distinguishing between 2 different kinds of virtues. Intellectual virtues are virtues that we learn through instruction. They can be taught by somebody else who instructs us. And moral virtues are different. These we acquire through habituation. This is a really important point that comes up again and again in the Nicomachean Ethics. And it means that you have to do virtuous things in order to become virtuous. We're going to explain how this is possible. But it's very important to remember that for Aristotle, his moral theory is a practical theory. It's about doing, it's about becoming, cultivating, and developing the virtues. It cannot be done purely theoretically in a closed room all by yourself. You have to go out in the world, you have to experience, and you have to practice the virtues. So where do the virtues come from? They do come in a sense from nature, but only in the sense that we are constituted to receive them. It is possible for us to become virtuous because of the kind of beings that we are. And this, of course, ties with everything he said so far and the function argument. That means that although by nature we can develop the virtues, they're not already predetermined. They're not within us and predetermined by our nature, but rather we are open to their development. And the question is, will they develop or not? As we shall see, it's a really important question. And really Aristotelian theory is in a very important respect a developmental theory. It talks about how you become virtuous. And there are a lot of ideas behind that. Okay, so virtue needs to be cultivated. So to learn virtue, we need to practice it and we need to exercise it. And then Aristotle says a sentence which has become quite famous and is often raised in lectures on the Nicomachean Ethics. And it's a very common question in exam questions if you're doing a degree in philosophy. Aristotle says we become just by performing just acts in the same way that we become good at other things. So how do you become a good builder? You have to go out there and try to build. So you become a good builder by building. If you sit in an office in front of a computer, you can't become a good builder. You might become something else, but there's no way you can become a good builder without practicing building. And he thinks that virtue is the same. You have to go out there and attempt to perform virtuous acts, just acts to become just, temperate acts to become temperate, kind acts in order to become kind. Otherwise, it won't happen. This is because we must give our actions a certain quality. If you go out there and always behave in a fearful and cowardly manner, how are you going to end up being courageous? You have to give your actions a fearless, courageous aspect in order to become a courageous person. So we must encourage ourselves to form the right habits in order to arrive at the right dispositions. Now this can seem circular, and this is always the question that's asked in philosophy exams at undergraduate level. Is Aristotle being circular here? That is his argument going around in a circle. How do we become a just person? Well, you perform just acts. And how can you perform just acts in the first place? Well, it seems like you need to be just already to figure out which are the just acts. If this is a circular argument, it would indeed be a quite silly thing. And remember, like always, when you hear a rather famous and revered philosopher say something really silly, stop and reconsider. Maybe you haven't completely understood what he said. And what Aristotle here is saying is not superficially circular, and he'll come back to this point in a second and explain why it's not. But for the moment, set it to one side, and I owe you an account why it is possible and how it is possible to perform just acts in order to become just, even though you're not just already, without having the circularity objection. But Aristotle sets this to one side for the moment and continues on with this idea that what we're studying here is not a theoretical project. We're not looking theoretically at what goodness is. We're interested in how to become a good man, a very practical project. So we're interested in how we can shape our dispositions to become good people. And here he repeats the earlier point that he's made as well in Book 1, that the kind of answer that we're going to get to this question, how do we shape our dispositions, what are the right kind of dispositions to cultivate, is not going to be precise. Because the subject matter is complex, there isn't going to be a specific rule-like or principle-like or short type answer that applies to all the kinds of situations that we're going to come across. It's going to be a really complex answer. But we do know, he says, that moral qualities are destroyed by excess and deficiency. Too much and too little is no good. Think about it. If you're scared of everything you come across, then you're likely to become a coward. If you're never scared, you find that nothing is fearful whatsoever, you're likely to become rash. It is in the nature of cowardice that it is an excess of fear, and it is in the nature of rashness that it is a deficiency of fear. The vices have this sense of excess and deficiency in them, therefore the virtue must be found in the mean, somewhere in the middle between excess and deficiency. Now again, he just presents this idea here, and he will go on to defend it and develop it in detail in the second part of the second book. So hold on to this thought, it will be coming up later in the next video. But the idea is that the moral qualities, the virtues that we're looking for, are preserved by the mean, and they're destroyed by too much and too little. They become vices. So the virtues have to be habituated. We have to exercise ourselves in order to become virtuous. And it is by resisting pleasures that we become temperate, and by resisting fears that we become courageous. So if you think of someone who's closed themselves in a room, in a dark room, all by themselves for their entire lives, can they emerge out of this room and say, I'm a very courageous person? This for Aristotle would be a very bizarre claim, because this person has never faced any fears and has never habituated themselves to stand up to the fears that they ought to stand up to in a courageous manner. So virtue is the exercise of virtue. It has to be practiced. Okay, so virtuous dispositions then include the right feeling. The courageous person faces danger, but without distress. It is important then to have been trained from when you're very, very young to have the right sorts of feelings and the right sorts of emotional responses to the right sorts of situations. And this can go right or this can go wrong. The training could have been a supportive one that helps you eventually cultivate the virtues, or not. But what happens right at the beginning is really important, because children can be put in the right sort of path. The child who is taught to suppress their anger when they have to share with other children is taught the appropriate expressions of anger. That times when we invite a friend over and we want to play with them are the sorts of times where you have to teach yourself to not be angry at sharing your toys with other children. Is the way you habituate yourself into expressing your anger only during the correct types of situations. So the kind of input and the kind of education, the kind of help that we get when we're very young to tell us this is the sort of situation where it's justified to be angry, and this is the kind of situation where you have to try really hard to calm down your feelings of anger and set them aside because they're not appropriate. These kinds of training and early education in childhood are extremely important because they orient our desires and they habituate our feelings towards the right kinds of directions. And somebody who has been habituated in the wrong kind of directions will have a huge obstacle to overcome when it comes to understanding what virtue requires of them, because their feelings are pushing them in the wrong sort of directions. So bad people seek the wrong pleasures at the wrong kind of time and indulge themselves in the wrong sort of ways, which then heightens these wrong feelings that are expressed yet again in the wrong direction. Once you go the wrong way, everything pushes you towards the wrong direction. Here, there is a little dig towards the Stoics. Aristotle says that our attitude towards our feelings should not be to suppress them, to try and make ourselves completely impartial and cool off from any kind of emotional response. That's not right. What we should do is target them. It is not anger that is the problem, it is untargeted anger that is the problem. That's why an early education how to target your anger is so important towards the right kind of things. So the object of morality and politics, because you remember that for Aristotle politics is very much linked with morality, is how to treat pleasures and pains correctly. How to identify the right kind of things to feel pleasure towards and the right kind of things to feel pain towards. When and how. Okay, so he moves on now to the next section. Do you remember I told you that there is potentially this superficially looking circular argument? We become just by performing just acts. Well, how can we perform just acts if we're not just already? Now he comes back to this and he gives us an explanation of how this is possible. How can we perform just actions if we're not already just? Firstly, he says, it is possible to do certain things even if you don't have the quality of those things. Even somebody inarticulate could manage to stick a few words together in such a way that they form a phrase simply by accident. It is possible to do things mistakenly, coincidentally, by accident, and that makes you appear articulate when you're not. But this is not what he has in mind here. He has in mind a distinction between doing virtuous things and actually being virtuous. And he says that to truly be virtuous, your actions need to have a certain kind of quality. And this is how they need to be done. They need to fulfill three conditions. Firstly, to be truly virtuous, you have to do what you're doing knowingly. And you have to be aware of what you're doing. Imagine an example. Suppose you have somebody who is not very familiar with computers and they're just getting to grips with how to do things, and they want to spend a very large amount of money on, I don't know, a new iPhone. They want to spend €1,000 on a new iPhone. But because they're a bit confused, they click on the wrong bit of whatever comes up on their screen and end up going to a charitable website where they in fact make a €1,000 donation to a very worthy cause. And imagine the cause is indeed the best thing you could do with your money, and the €1,000 goes on to help people who are in need in a variety of ways and does an enormous amount of good. Would you say that this is a kind act? Well, what else is it? It is a kind act. €1,000 has gone to help those who suffer and are in pain, are in need of this money, and has been useful to the people who needed it. So it is a kind thing to do. But is the person who did it kind? Clearly they're not, because what they did was mistaken. It was accidental. They didn't know what they were doing when they were doing it. So we can't say that they're due moral praise and blame for something that they did unknowingly. The second condition is that acts have to be chosen and chosen for their own sake. in order for them to be virtuous. If you do something, but you choose it for the wrong reason, so if you perform the kind act, but you don't do it because you recognize it as a kind act, and you feel the force of the need to do the kind act in response to the requirement for kindness. So if you do the kind act to show off to your friends, that's not a kind act. That's a showing off. Something kind has happened, but it's not the virtue of kindness because you didn't choose it. So your choices or your actions have to reflect your choices. It can't just be a kind act. It has to be a kind act that you chose to do because it is a kind act. And thirdly, virtues proceed from permanent dispositions. The kind person isn't kind just once in their lives and never again. The kind person responds to every occasion where kindness is the correct response. They have a dispositional tendency to be kind. That means that every time they come across a requirement for kindness, there is a motivation for them to be kind, stably, long term, as the kind of person that they are, because they possess this character trait of kindness, not just a one-off temperamental, I was feeling like that on this particular day, but tomorrow I'm never going to feel kind ever again. Okay. So virtues, to be virtuous, and the virtues have to fulfill three conditions. The act has to be done knowingly, it has to be chosen and chosen for its own sake, and it has to proceed from a permanent disposition. That means that there are a lot of things that you can do that are like virtue but not virtue, that you do on the road to virtue. So when you have a toddler and his friend visits and the parents say, share your red truck, and the toddler does it grumpily and does it because he's kind of been obliged to do it by the parents, you don't have virtue here. You don't have the virtue of justice and distributory justice, but you do have the beginnings of how to learn about justice. Maybe at the beginning you have to follow the example of somebody else who simply tells you what to do, like share the red truck. And it takes a little while until you're old enough to understand what it means to have a friend over, because part of friendships and part of having a friend over to play with you is sharing the things that you're going to play with. It doesn't make much sense to invite somebody and cut them off from touching any of your things when the whole point was, come to share and play and be a friend with me. Now this starts giving you glimpses into what friendship might be as well. It doesn't mean that at the end of the play date you've understood the concept of friendship. It's going to take years and years and many wrong turns for you to figure out what is involved in friendship and other respects of the virtue that have to do with loyalty, trust, honesty, dependence on somebody who's a friend, dependability. So the picture is going to emerge after a long time, but that doesn't mean that you can't get glimpses of it. And by doing acts that try to have a specific quality, you come to understand what it is, what the quality is, and why it is valuable over a long period of time, with many mistakes and failures and setbacks and many things that are determined by factors that are outside of your control. All this is to come. Aristotle will talk about this later on. But this is what he means and why it is possible to perform just acts even though you're not just yet. You perform them under instructions, or because you're following a role model, or with a partial understanding of why they're the right thing to do. And all this is an educational tool on the way to virtue. When you truly have virtue, then you perform the acts truly virtuously, knowingly, chosen for their own sake, and from a permanent and stable disposition to act so over a long period of time, because you have the character trait of virtue. But that takes a long time to acquire. Fake it till you make it, basically, is what Aristotle is saying here. And that is a useful educational process. Okay. This is why he says at the end, acts are called just and temperate when they are such as a just and temperate man would do. Okay. So the acts have the quality of justice, when they're the kinds of acts that a just person would do. But what makes the agent just or temperate is not merely the fact that he does such things, because you could end up doing the just thing accidentally, unknowingly, for some other reason, not because you chose it, as a one-off. So what makes that person just is the fact that he does them in a way that just and temperate men do. How do just and temperate men do just acts? Knowingly chosen for their own sakes and out of permanent dispositions. Okay, that again reiterates the point that practice is crucial to becoming virtuous, and you can't become virtuous purely through a theoretical contemplation of what goodness or virtue might be. And he gives here the example of somebody who is sick. A sick person is not going to become better simply by thinking about health and what is involved in health. They have to take the treatment. They have to actually do the things that are going to lead to health. It's exactly the same with virtue. So, back to the original question. What kind of thing is virtue? Aristotle says that there are three possibilities which are part of the soul. The soul is made up of feelings, faculties, and dispositions. So which one of these is the virtues? Feelings are things like desire, anger, jealousy, pity, envy. Faculties are susceptibilities in virtue of which we are capable of these feelings, being capable of anger, being capable of sorrow, being capable of pity. Whereas dispositions are tendencies to be well or ill disposed with respect to those feelings. So you have a bad disposition with respect to anger if you have a strong or weak tendency to get angry. If you have a strong tendency to get angry, you are irascible. You get angry at the wrong kind of things. You are too angry. It is an excess of anger. If you have a weak disposition with respect to anger, you're a doormat. You're the kind of person who doesn't get angry even when you should. You should be angry in situations where you need to stand up for yourself. When some kind of injustice has been done to you, you should respond with anger. But some people have a disposition to be less angry than they ought to be. This is a temperamental tendency. Okay? And as you would expect, because of what he said before about excess and deficiencies characterizing the vices and virtue being a mean, it's moderation or moderate tendencies that are the good ones. We will talk a lot more about this when we talk about the doctrine of the mean, and there are many ways in which these things can be misunderstood. So please watch the next video in part 2 of book 2 of the Nicomachean Ethics before you make up your mind on what it is that Aristotle is saying here with respect to moderation. Because although we're using this word, it's a technical term, and he'll go on to explain in a technical way what he means by the mean and a moderate amount of feeling. For now, it means a feeling that is neither too much nor too little. In that respect, it is moderate. It stands between two extremes, an excess and a deficiency. But we'll come back to that. Meanwhile, he's still looking at whether the virtues could be feelings, faculties, or dispositions. And he says the virtues cannot be feelings because we don't hold people morally responsible for their feelings. So if somebody is feeling fearful or if somebody is feeling sad, this is not the kind of thing that morally praise or blame them for. Feelings are not the subject of moral judgments. And the same with faculties. The faculty, the capability of anger, is not itself what it is that we judge. We judge people for their dispositions, their tendencies to act in accordance with their feelings. Therefore, the virtues are dispositions, because the virtues are moral qualities. They're the kinds of things that we hold people morally responsible for, that we praise them for, and the vices are the kind of things that correspondingly we blame people for. So if the virtues and the vices are things that are the subject of moral judgment, they have to be dispositions, because dispositions are the only thing that we praise and blame, morally praise and blame people for. One final bit, and then we'll stop here with this video before he goes on to explaining the doctrine of the mean. What kind of disposition is virtue? Here he goes back to the function argument from book 1. So any excellence makes the thing that is excellent good and makes it perform its function well. So the excellence of the eye makes both the eye a good eye and its function performed well. So it is a good eye and it sees well, and that is the excellence of being an eye. So human excellence is the disposition that makes one a good man and causes him to perform his function well. And we need to examine the nature of virtue to understand what this means. So looking at what is virtue will explain in what sense the function of man is a life in accordance lived with reason. That's what he goes on to do with the doctrine of the mean, which we're going to look at the next video, because the second half of book 2 is quite complex and we're going to need a little bit more time. And that's it for today. Thank you.